A severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds after decapitation. 30 grotesque seconds where the brain, starved of oxygen but not yet dead, continues to process reality. The eyes might blink, the lips might move, forming words that no sound can carry. Consciousness lingers in that horrifying twilight between life and oblivion. For Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, this medical fact wasn't academic theory. It was her final, terrifying reality on May 19th, 1536, as her head tumbled from the scaffold on Tower Green. In those last 30 seconds, what thoughts raced through her dying mind? Did she think of her 3-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, suddenly bastardized? Did she curse the man who had once promised her the world? Or did she simply wonder how it had all gone so catastrophically wrong? Your history textbooks won't tell you this story. They prefer the sanitized version. Anne Boleyn was executed for treason. Clean, simple, historically convenient. But the truth is far more disturbing. Anne Boleyn wasn't just executed, she was systematically destroyed through one of history's most calculated campaigns of psychological warfare, character assassination, and political theater. What you're about to read is the story they don't want you to know. The dark truth that reveals how absolute power doesn't just corrupt it, annihilates, and how a brilliant woman was tortured, broken, and erased from history for the crime of being too intelligent, too influential, too dangerous for a king who had grown tired of her. This is not the Anne Boleyn of romantic novels or sanitized documentaries. This is the real woman who endured 17 days of psychological hell before facing one of history's most macabre public spectacles. This is the story of how a queen became a cautionary tale, and how her death was designed to terrorize every woman in England into submission. Welcome to the dark truth behind the most famous execution in English history. The cloth of gold caught the morning light streaming through Westminster Abbey's ancient windows as Anne Boleyn processed down the aisle toward her coronation. She moved like a goddess made flesh, her dark eyes surveying the assembled nobility with barely concealed triumph. This was her moment of ultimate victory, the culmination of a 6-year campaign that had torn apart English Catholicism, defied the Pope, and forced a king to risk civil war. The ceremony was deliberately lavish, a 20,000 spectacle designed to embed Anne's legitimacy into the very stones of Westminster. As the Archbishop of Canterbury lowered St. Edward's crown onto her dark hair, she became what no woman had been in over 4 centuries, a queen crowned in her own right, not merely as a king's consort. The congregation fell to their knees, acknowledging her as their sovereign lady. Henry VIII watched from his throne, utterly besotted. For 6 years, this brilliant, mercurial woman had held him captive. She was unlike any woman at court, educated in France, politically astute, sexually magnetic, but frustratingly unavailable. Where other women submitted, Anne commanded. Where others begged for favor, Anne negotiated from strength. She had transformed herself from a minor courtier's daughter into the most powerful woman in Europe. But power as Anne would discover, is the most dangerous drug in human history, and Henry VIII was an addict who would kill for his next fix. 3 years later, May 2nd, 1536, the same Westminster Abbey that had witnessed Anne's triumph now seemed to mock her with its empty silence. Barely 40 miles away, in the Tower of London, the woman who had once commanded kings now huddled in a stone cell, waiting for death. The transformation was incomprehensible in its speed and brutality. On May 1st, she had been Queen of England, discussing plans for her daughter Elizabeth's education. By May 2nd, she was a prisoner charged with adultery, incest, and high treason crimes so outrageous they wouldn't survive 5 minutes of cross-examination in any legitimate court. But this wasn't about justice. This was about power, control, and the systematic destruction of a woman who had committed the unforgivable sin of making a king feel small. The charges were a masterpiece of character assassination adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George, conspiracy to murder the king, witchcraft. The accusations read like the fever dreams of a paranoid misogynist, but they served their purpose perfectly. They didn't need to be true, they just needed to be believed. Henry's propaganda machine had been working overtime for months, preparing the English people for this moment. Whisper campaigns in taverns, sermons from compliant priests, strategic leaks to foreign ambassadors. By the time Anne was arrested, public opinion had been thoroughly poisoned against her. The woman they had once called their queen was now widely despised as a scheming adulteress who had bewitched their beloved king. The psychological impact on Anne was immediate and devastating. One day, she was planning state dinners. The next, she was being interrogated about her alleged sexual history by men who regarded her as barely human. The whiplash from ultimate power to utter powerlessness would have broken most people instantly, but Anne Boleyn was not most people. She was a survivor who had clawed her way from minor nobility to the throne through pure intelligence and will. She wouldn't break easily, which is why they had 17 days to work on her. 17 days to transform a defiant queen into a broken woman, ready for public slaughter. The Anatomy of Psychological Warfare. Tower of London, May 2nd through May 19th, 1536. Modern psychologists have a term for what Anne Boleyn endured during her imprisonment: systematic psychological torture. Every element of her captivity was carefully designed to break her mind before they broke her neck. The cell itself was a weapon. Anne had been housed in the same royal apartments she had occupied during her coronation preparations 3 years earlier. The same rooms, the same view, the same tapestries, but now transformed into a prison. This wasn't coincidence. It was calculated cruelty. Every familiar object was a reminder of how far she had fallen, how completely her world had been inverted. Sleep deprivation came next. Tower records show that Anne's schedule was deliberately disrupted. Interrogations at odd hours, unexpected visits from court officials. The constant uncertainty of when guards might arrive kept her in a state of hypervigilance that slowly ate away at her sanity. But the most insidious torture was the scheduled executions that never came. On May 15th, she was told she would die the next morning. She spent the night in prayer, mentally preparing for death. Morning came, and nothing. Guards brought breakfast instead of a priest. The execution was postponed. This happened repeatedly. The uncertainty was agonizing. Not knowing when death would come, she existed in a constant state of anticipatory terror. Modern interrogators recognize this as one of the most effective ways to break a subject's psychological defenses. The isolation was equally calculated. Anne was allowed visits from only a handful of carefully selected ladies-in-waiting women who were themselves terrified of being implicated in her alleged crimes. These weren't companions. They were unwilling witnesses to her breakdown, too frightened to offer genuine comfort. Meanwhile, the character assassination campaign reached fever pitch outside the Tower walls. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, orchestrated a propaganda blitz that would impress modern spin doctors. Pamphlets detailing Anne's alleged sexual escapades circulated through London. Court preachers delivered sermons about the dangers of ambitious women. Foreign ambassadors received carefully crafted briefings about Anne's proven infidelity. Every detail was designed to ensure that by the time Anne faced the executioner, she would be so thoroughly reviled that her death would seem like justice rather than murder. The English people needed to want her dead, not just accept it. The psychological pressure was relentless and multifaceted. Anne was forced to listen as court officials read detailed accusations about her alleged sexual relationships. They described supposed encounters in graphic detail, watching her face for reactions, building a case based on her responses to fabricated evidence. She was told that her alleged lovers had already confessed under torture, a lie designed to make resistance seem pointless. She was informed that her brother George had admitted to their incestuous relationship, another fabrication calculated to cause maximum emotional damage. The brilliance of the campaign was its comprehensiveness. They weren't just destroying Anne's body, they were systematically dismantling her sense of reality, her relationships, her past, her future, and her very identity. They were conducting an execution on every level of human existence simultaneously. By May 15th, cracks were beginning to show. Witnesses reported that Anne's behavior had become erratic. She would pray frantically for hours, then burst into inappropriate laughter. She made jokes about being called Anne sans tête, Anne without a head. This wasn't courage. It was dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism that occurs when reality becomes too horrific to process normally. Her mind was protecting itself the only way it could, by disconnecting from the nightmare she was living. But even this defense would prove temporary. They had 17 days to break her completely, and they were making excellent progress. The erasure protocol. While Anne rotted in the Tower, Henry VIII was implementing what can only be described as historical genocide, a systematic attempt to erase her from existence. This wasn't just about killing a woman. It was about murdering the very memory that she had ever mattered. The erasure began immediately after her arrest. Palace workers received orders to remove every trace of Anne's presence from royal residences. Her initials, intertwined with Henry's in countless decorative elements, were chiseled from walls. Her personal motto, "The most happy," was literally scratched out of stone inscriptions. Tapestries bearing her arms were burned or reworked. Court painters received special instructions: destroy all portraits of Anne Boleyn, not hide them, not store them, destroy them. The systematic annihilation of her image was so thorough that only 3 contemporary portraits survive today, and historians debate whether any are authentic. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. Thomas Cromwell understood that controlling the narrative was crucial. Anne couldn't just be executed. She had to be transformed in the public mind from a beloved queen into a reviled traitor. The speed and efficiency of this character assassination campaign was breathtaking. Planted witnesses began coming forward with new evidence of Anne's alleged crimes. Servants claimed to have seen her in compromising situations. Courtiers suddenly remembered suspicious conversations. Musicians reported that she had commissioned love songs for men other than the king. Every aspect of her past was reinterpreted through the lens of sexual misconduct and treason. The most vicious attacks targeted her femininity and intelligence, the very qualities that had made her dangerous. She was described as a witch who had used supernatural powers to bewitch the king. Her political influence was reframed as manipulation and scheming. Her education and wit were transformed into evidence of her deviousness. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts that Anne had been revealed as a great whore who had corrupted English court life. These reports, carefully orchestrated by Cromwell's agents, ensured that Anne's reputation was destroyed across Europe. Even if she somehow survived, she would be radioactive, too toxic for any foreign court to support. The attack on her daughter Elizabeth was particularly cruel. The 3-year-old princess was immediately declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. Her household was disbanded, her allowance cut, her status as a royal princess revoked. Overnight, she went from heir to the throne to unwanted bastard. This wasn't just political necessity. It was psychological warfare directed at Anne. She was forced to watch as her child became collateral damage in Henry's campaign to destroy her legacy. The message was clear. Not only would Anne die, but everything she had fought for would die with her. Court officials were instructed to treat Anne's name as if it were cursed. Mentioning her in positive terms became dangerous for one's career. Courtiers learned that even acknowledging she had once been queen could earn royal displeasure. The systematic silence that descended around her name was as complete as it was chilling. The legal proceedings themselves were a carefully choreographed farce. The court that tried Anne was packed with Henry's supporters and men who owed their positions to his favor. The evidence was laughably thin, mostly consisting of circumstantial observations and forced confessions extracted under torture from her alleged lovers. But the trial wasn't about establishing guilt. It was about providing a legal veneer for what everyone knew was political murder. The proceedings followed proper forms and procedures, creating the illusion of justice while ensuring the predetermined outcome. The most telling detail was the date of her execution. It was scheduled before her trial had even concluded. They weren't waiting to determine her guilt. They were simply going through the motions of legal process to legitimize her predetermined death. Henry himself was notably absent from all proceedings. The king, who had once risked everything to marry Anne, couldn't even be bothered to attend her trial or execution. He was already at his next residence, planning his wedding to Jane Seymour, scheduled for May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's death. The speed with which Henry moved on was itself a form of psychological torture. Anne was dying while her replacement was already being fitted for wedding dresses. She was being erased, not just from history, but from Henry's personal timeline. It was as if their entire relationship, 6 years of courtship, 3 years of marriage, a daughter together, had never happened. By May 18th, the erasure protocol was nearly complete. Anne Boleyn the Queen had been successfully transformed into Anne Boleyn the traitor. Public opinion had been manipulated to support her death. Legal proceedings had provided the necessary cover. All that remained was the final act, her physical destruction. But even in death, she would not be allowed dignity. What awaited her on Tower Green was not a quick, merciful execution, but a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater designed to terrorize every woman in England into submission. May 19th, 1536, dawn. Death came with the sunrise, but it arrived as performance art rather than execution. What happened on Tower Green that morning was not justice. It was the final act of the most sophisticated character assassination in English history, a piece of political theater designed to transform murder into entertainment. The stage had been set with deliberate precision. The scaffold stood just 3 feet high, low enough to ensure the crowd could see every detail of Anne's suffering, but elevated enough to make her death a spectacle visible to hundreds. This wasn't the towering platform of later executions. It was an intimate venue for communal voyeurism. The crowd itself had been carefully cultivated for weeks. London's taverns and markets had buzzed with stories of Anne's alleged crimes. Cromwell's agents had seeded public opinion with lurid details of her supposed sexual adventures. By execution day, the crowd wasn't just watching a queen die, they were attending the righteous slaughter of a proven adulteress and traitor. Vendors hawked food and drink as if this were a festival. Spectators placed bets on whether Anne would maintain her composure or break down weeping. The atmosphere was encouraged to be celebratory. Death as entertainment. Murder as public holiday. The French executioner was himself part of the performance. Henry had imported him specifically for this occasion, paying an enormous fee for his services. This wasn't mercy, it was ostentation. The message was clear. Henry was so wealthy, so powerful, that he could afford to import death from France. Anne's execution was a display of royal resources as much as royal justice. When they came for Anne in her cell, she was already broken. 17 days of psychological torture had transformed the confident queen into a hollow-eyed woman on the edge of complete mental collapse. She wore a simple gray dress and white coif, deliberately modest clothing that stripped away any remaining regality. The walk from her cell to Tower Green was choreographed to maximize humiliation. She was escorted by guards as if she might attempt escape. Though everyone knew she was too psychologically shattered to try. The same corridors where she had once processed as queen now served as her final walk of shame. The crowd's reaction when she appeared was everything Cromwell had hoped for. Instead of the sympathy that might have greeted a beloved queen, there were jeers and accusations. Witch, adulteress, traitor. The mob had been successfully weaponized against their former sovereign. Anne's final speech was itself a masterpiece of coerced performance. Standing on the low scaffold, surrounded by hostile faces, She delivered words that had clearly been negotiated in advance. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. Notice what she didn't say. She never admitted guilt, even in her final moments, psychologically broken and facing imminent death. Anne refused to confess to crimes she hadn't committed. It was a final act of defiance disguised as submission, the last rebellion of a woman who had once commanded kings. The execution itself was designed for maximum theatrical impact. Anne knelt upright in the French style rather than placing her head on a block. The executioner's sword was concealed behind his back to prevent her from flinching at the wrong moment. Her eyes were bound not out of mercy, but to ensure she wouldn't ruin the performance by turning away. The crowd fell silent as the sword was raised. In that moment, the carnival atmosphere evaporated, replaced by the terrible solemnity of state-sanctioned murder. Even spectators who had come for entertainment found themselves confronted with the reality of watching a human being destroyed for political convenience. The blade fell with professional precision, clean, quick, efficient. Anne's head separated from her body in a single stroke, tumbling to the scaffold floor as blood sprayed across the wooden platform. But what happened next was what even hardened executioners found disturbing. For nearly 30 seconds, Anne's severed head continued to show signs of consciousness. Her eyes blinked, her lips moved, perhaps still forming prayers. Several witnesses reported seeing her eyes track movement, as if she was still aware of her surroundings. The executioner, following tradition, lifted her head by the hair to display it to the crowd. But instead of the triumphant cheer that usually greeted such moments, there was horrified silence. Even people who had wanted Anne dead found themselves sickened by the grotesque spectacle of her still conscious severed head. Several spectators fainted. Others vomited. The sight was so disturbing that even courtiers accustomed to Tudor brutality couldn't watch. The carnival atmosphere had evaporated completely, replaced by collective trauma at what they had witnessed. Henry VIII was notably absent from the proceedings. The king who had orchestrated this elaborate murder couldn't even be bothered to attend. He was already at Windsor Castle, celebrating his engagement to Jane Seymour. While Anne's blood was still wet on the scaffold, Henry was planning his next wedding. The disposal of Anne's body was the final insult. No coffin had been prepared, an oversight that was clearly intentional. Her terrified ladies-in-waiting had to find an old arrow chest to serve as her final resting place, a Queen of England, stuffed into a box, meant for weapons. She was buried hastily in the Tower Chapel, without proper ceremony, in an unmarked grave that would remain unidentified for centuries, even in death. She was denied the dignity afforded to common criminals. But perhaps the most chilling detail was how quickly life returned to normal. Within hours, the scaffold was dismantled, the blood washed away, and Tower Green returned to its usual function as a courtyard. It was as if nothing had happened, as if a queen hadn't just been murdered in broad daylight for the entertainment of the masses. The message was clear. This is what happens to women who rise too high, challenge too much, refuse to disappear when they become inconvenient. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just about ending one woman's life. It was about terrorizing an entire gender into submission. And for centuries, it worked. The trauma from Anne Boleyn's execution rippled outward like blood in water, contaminating everyone it touched. This wasn't just about one woman's death. It was about the systematic destruction of everyone and everything connected to her. Her ladies-in-waiting faced the most immediate horror. These women themselves, terrified of being implicated in Anne's alleged crimes, were forced to perform the grisly task of preparing her severed head and body for burial. They had to wash the blood from her face, arrange her features into something resembling peace, and somehow fit her remains into that inadequate arrow chest. Lady Rochford, who had served Anne faithfully for years, suffered what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Court records show she began experiencing violent nightmares, would wake screaming about severed heads, and eventually suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Within 2 years, she had entered a convent, unable to continue court life after what she had witnessed. The trauma extended to Anne's daughter Elizabeth. Though she was too young to understand its full implications, at 3 years old, she suddenly found herself stripped of royal status. Her household disbanded, her allowance eliminated. Servants who had once treated her as a princess now avoided her as if she carried some contagion. Elizabeth's governess reported that the little girl kept asking why her mother had gone away and when she would return. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that her mother has been judicially murdered by her father? The psychological damage from this abandonment would shape Elizabeth's character for the rest of her life, her lifelong fear of marriage, her terror of emotional dependence, her compulsive need for control. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, had been executed 2 days earlier, along with 4 other men accused of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths created secondary trauma throughout the court. Families connected to the Boleyn faction found themselves suddenly radioactive. Marriages were hastily dissolved. Friendships were publicly renounced. Associates fled court in terror of being tainted by association. The broader psychological impact on Henry's court was profound and lasting. Courtiers learned that proximity to the king was not protection, it was danger. Today's favorite could become tomorrow's traitor, based on nothing more than royal whim. The paranoia and fear that settled over the English court would persist for the remainder of Henry's reign. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their masters that the English court had become a place of whispers and terror, where no one dared speak freely and everyone watched their backs. The casual brutality of Anne's destruction sent a message that echoed across Europe. Henry VIII was not just absolute, he was unpredictable and therefore terrifying. But perhaps the most insidious effect was the systematic erasure of Anne's memory. Within months, it became dangerous to even mention her name positively at court. Courtiers who had once competed for her favor now competed to forget they had ever known her. Her portraits disappeared from palace walls. Her coat of arms was chiseled from buildings. Her personal possessions were redistributed or destroyed. The very rooms she had occupied were redecorated to eliminate any trace of her presence. It was as if the entire English establishment was trying to convince itself that she had never existed. The propaganda campaign against her continued even after death. Ballads circulated describing her as a witch who had enchanted the king. Plays were written depicting her as a scheming adulteress who got her just desserts. History was being rewritten in real time. transforming a brilliant political player into a one-dimensional villain. Henry's speed in moving on to his next wife was itself a form of continuing violence against Anne's memory. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's execution, making it clear that Anne had been not just replaceable, but forgettable. The message was that queens were interchangeable accessories, not human beings deserving of basic dignity. The legal precedent set by Anne's trial would prove disastrous for future queens. The techniques used to destroy her manufactured evidence, forced confessions, character assassination would be refined and reused. Catherine Howard would face an almost identical fate just 5 years later, proving that Anne's execution had established a template for disposing of inconvenient wives. But there were some who refused to forget. A few loyal servants preserved letters and documents. Some courtiers quietly maintained their respect for Anne's memory. These small acts of remembrance would prove crucial centuries later when historians began reconstructing the truth about her life and death. The irony is that Henry's attempts to erase Anne ultimately ensured her immortality. The very extremity of his efforts to destroy her memory created a mystery that would fascinate historians for centuries. By trying to make her disappear, he made her unforgettable. Anne's daughter Elizabeth would eventually become England's greatest monarch, ruling for 45 years and transforming England into a European power. In her, Anne's intelligence and political acumen lived on, proving that you cannot kill ideas by killing the people who embody them. But the immediate aftermath of Anne's execution was nothing but trauma, terror, and systematic erasure. Those who had witnessed her rise and fall learned a hard lesson about the nature of absolute power. It tolerates no limits, recognizes no boundaries, and will destroy anyone who challenges its prerogatives. The blood on Tower Green had been washed away within hours, but the psychological stains would last for generations. The modern parallel, how power still kills. 500 years after Anne Boleyn's execution, we tell ourselves that such systematic character assassination and judicial murder couldn't happen today. We are civilized. We have laws. We have human rights. We have learned from history's mistakes. We are lying to ourselves. The techniques used to destroy Anne Boleyn, psychological warfare, media manipulation, systematic erasure, character assassination, haven't disappeared. They've evolved. They've become more sophisticated. And in our digital age, they've become more powerful than Thomas Cromwell could have imagined. Consider the modern tools of character destruction. Social media pylons orchestrated by political operatives. Deepfake videos that make anyone appear to say anything. Coordinated disinformation campaigns that can destroy reputations overnight. The weaponization of a public opinion that Cromwell achieved through pamphlets and sermons now happens at light speed through algorithms and bot networks. The psychological torture that broke Anne's mind in 17 days can now be compressed into 17 hours of trending hashtags, doxing campaigns, and viral humiliation. The isolation she experienced in the tower is recreated through digital mob harassment that makes victims afraid to leave their homes or check their phones. The erasure protocol that eliminated Anne from official records is now practiced through deplatforming, shadow banning, and coordinated deletion of digital presence. Modern power doesn't need to chisel names from stone walls. It can simply make inconvenient people disappear from search results. Social media and public discourse. The same techniques that made Anne's execution seem justified to tutor crowds are used today to manufacture consent for character assassinations, leaked private communications taken out of context, weaponized accusations of moral failings, the systematic destruction of credibility before physical or professional destruction follows. Even the speed of Henry's transition to Jane Seymour has modern parallels. Political figures and celebrities destroyed by scandal are replaced so quickly that public attention moves on before questions can be asked about the methods used to bring them down. The news cycle has become a conveyor belt of character assassinations, each one forgotten before the next begins. The systematic silencing that followed Anne's death, where mentioning her name became dangerous, is replicated through cancel culture, where association with disfavored people or ideas can destroy careers and relationships. The fear that gripped Tudor courtiers now grips modern institutions, where people police their own speech to avoid becoming the next target. But perhaps the most chilling parallel is how modern power structures have learned to make character assassination seem like justice. Just as Anne's destruction was framed as righteous punishment for moral failings, modern victims are often portrayed as deserving their fate. The mob is taught to see destruction as accountability, silencing as consequences, erasure as justice. The technology has changed, but the underlying psychology remains the same. Humans are still vulnerable to manipulation. They still enjoy watching the powerful fall. They still participate in collective violence when it's framed as moral action. They still prefer simple narratives of guilt and innocence to complex truths about power and politics. The lesson of Anne Boleyn's execution isn't that medieval people were more brutal than modern ones. It's that human nature doesn't change, and absolute power will always find new ways to destroy those who challenge it. The methods evolve, but the motives remain constant control, intimidation, and the elimination of inconvenient truth tellers. We see Anne's story playing out repeatedly in our own time, whistleblowers destroyed for revealing government crimes, journalists eliminated for investigating powerful figures, activists disappeared for challenging corporate interests. The tools are different, but the pattern is identical: character assassination, isolation, systematic erasure, and either literal or metaphorical execution. The most disturbing realization is that we've become more efficient at this process. What took Henry VIII's regime 17 days and significant resources can now be accomplished in hours through digital manipulation and mob psychology. We've industrialized character assassination. But there's also hope in Anne's story. Despite Henry's best efforts to erase her, she survived in memory. Truth has a way of emerging eventually, even when powerful forces try to bury it. The very extremity of the efforts to destroy her made her story irresistible to later investigators. Modern victims of character assassination campaigns often experience the same phenomenon. The more extreme and systematic the attacks, the more they eventually arouse suspicion. The techniques that destroyed Anne Boleyn can be studied, understood, and potentially resisted. The key is recognizing the pattern before it's too late. When you see coordinated attacks on someone's character, when you witness systematic efforts to isolate and dehumanize a target, when you observe the speed with which public opinion can be manipulated, remember Anne Boleyn. Remember that the same techniques used to justify her execution are still being used today. The scaffold on Tower Green has been replaced by digital platforms and media campaigns, but the essential dynamic remains unchanged: absolute power, killing those who challenge it, while making the killing look like justice. 500 years later, we're still watching executions. We've just learned to call them something else. Epilogue: The Severed Head's Revenge. In the end, Henry VIII failed completely. He wanted to erase Anne Boleyn from history, but she became one of its most studied figures. He wanted to destroy her legacy, but her daughter ruled England for 45 glorious years. He wanted to silence her story, but it has been told and retold for 5 centuries. He wanted to make her forgettable, but she haunts English history like no other queen. The king who tried to obliterate her memory is now remembered primarily as the man who killed Anne Boleyn. His 8 wives have been reduced to a children's rhyme, his political achievements forgotten, his massive ego deflated by historical judgment. The woman he tried to erase has erased him instead. This is the severed head's ultimate revenge: immortality through martyrdom. By making Anne's death so brutal, so calculated, so psychologically sophisticated, Henry ensured that it would fascinate people forever. Her execution became more famous than her life, more influential than her reign, more powerful than her crown. But this revenge came at a terrible cost. Anne achieved immortality at the price of being remembered primarily as a victim rather than as the brilliant political player she actually was. History remembers her death more vividly than her achievements, her suffering more clearly than her strengths. The real tragedy of Anne Boleyn isn't that she died young. It's that the manner of her death overshadowed the magnificence of her life. She was reduced to a cautionary tale about ambitious women, when she should be celebrated as a political genius who nearly succeeded in one of history's most audacious power grabs. Yet even in this distortion, there's power. Anne's story serves as a permanent warning about what absolute power will do to maintain itself. Every time someone reads about her execution, they're reminded that authority will always try to destroy those who challenge it. Her death teaches lessons that her life alone never could. In our modern era of character assassination and digital mob justice, Anne Boleyn's story is more relevant than ever. The techniques used to destroy her: psychological warfare, media manipulation, systematic erasure, public humiliation, are the same ones used against inconvenient truth-tellers today. Her execution provides a roadmap for recognizing and potentially resisting modern forms of political murder. The woman whose head was severed on Tower Green 5 centuries ago still has the power to make tyrants uncomfortable. As long as people remember how easily power can destroy innocence, how quickly public opinion can be manipulated, how systematically truth can be buried, as long as people remember Anne Boleyn, absolute power will never feel entirely secure. That may be the most fitting revenge of all. Henry VIII wanted Anne to disappear, but instead, she became eternal. He wanted her to be forgotten, but she became unforgettable. He wanted her death to intimidate other women into submission, but it inspired them to resistance. The severed head won in the end, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple power of truth to survive every attempt to kill it. Anne Boleyn's execution was meant to be the end of her story. Instead, it was just the beginning. In those final 30 seconds of consciousness, as her severed head lay on the scaffold and her dying brain processed its last thoughts, perhaps Anne Boleyn understood something that Henry VIII never would. You cannot kill an idea by killing the person who embodies it. You can only make it immortal.